So today we are going to be harvesting our stinging nettles. And it's actually really funny because normally the stinging nettles are all over. In fact, like as a kid, you learned to identify stinging nettles. It was probably the first plant that I learned how to identify as a kid, because once you brush up against one of them things, I mean, they're called stinging nettles for a reason. And you'd get like these big old welts. It would sting for like hours. And anytime you went out in the woods to build a fort or just to go play and run around in the springtime, like they're everywhere. And so this year I came out to harvest stinging nettles and I was like traipsing around over the field to find a spot. So it's really interesting. I'm like, if I didn't want them, you'll find them everywhere. When I do want them, I had to find a patch. But what I actually think it is, we had just turned the cows loose into our wooded section of pasture where we kind of have a wood and pasture, so silvopasture. And because the stinging nettles are tiny and tender for the most part, like there's a few of these that are a little bit bigger, like this guy, but then most of these are like little tiny ones, like they're just starting to pop up. So when they're little and tender like that, and the cows have been aching for fresh green and they're done with the hay, I think they ate all of them that were in my regular patch. Once they get bigger like this, then they don't tend to eat them as much because they get kind of fibrous. So anyways, that is my hypothesis, because when I was a kid in the woods, the cows didn't get turned into that side of the pasture. So it's really funny. Like I said, as a kid, stinging nettles you just knew them because they stung you and just thought they were like a nuisance, just a weed. But stinging nettles are actually really incredible. And I have come to love them, even with all of their stinging and zappingness. And it's one of the very first things that we harvest. And I have an affinity for foraging because I love gardening and I love all of the plants that we put in and tending them. But I really love things that just show up for me in the spring that I literally do nothing and they come up. All I have to do is harvest them. And the really cool thing about stinging nettles, not only is it a food, but it also has some incredible medicinal properties, which I really love. Dual purpose. I like things that serve multiple functions. So with the stinging nettles, it's kind of cool because they can be an indicator of really rich soil, and they like the shaded areas where we have full sun. They don't seem to come in as much, but they really like kind of this dappled shaded area, but they can be an indication that you have really nice rich soil. And they do like where it's moist, which is part of the reason they stay kind of in that dappled shade line, and really like where we've got all the leaves that have fallen down and created this really nice mulch. So you definitely want to wear gloves. I've heard tale of people that say they can touch the leaf with their bare hands just right and pick them. My hat off to you. I'm not willing to develop that talent. So with the stinging nettles, gloves, and then I love these little snips, and these work really good. So you want to get them when they're relatively small before they have went to seed in the springtime. One, the leaves are more tender and they aren't fibrous and woody. So I'm just going to come in and get the top section of these. And this one's a little bit taller. And I am just after the leaves. I don't actually want the stem, especially when it's this far along, because it's kind of woody and fibrous. So I'm just going to go ahead and snip off the leaves for this guy. Now you can grow them from seed, and they will go to seed, which is why I'm saying you ideally want to harvest them in the spring before they have went to seed when you're after the leaf part. There is medicinal uses for the seed, but generally you're going to harvest that in the fall. You're not going to get it right now. We have such a big patch here. I'm being kind of picky. I'm only taking the leaves that don't have any bug bites or any damage on them. And of course, anytime you're foraging, you don't want to forage everything. You want to leave some, but the stinging nettles are so prolific here that I'm not really worried about over foraging them. So I don't know if you can see, but the reason they're called stinging nettle is they have all of these little, they're like little tiny needles. They almost look like hairs, and they're on the stem. They're on the underneath part of the leaf, and they're also on the top part of the leaf. And those, once they hit your skin, they actually are a histamine. And so stinging nettles are known for using with allergies, and also can be used for joint pain and arthritis. But that is the actual, what the stinging part is. It's these tiny little hairs. So if you let them sit and they get kind of wilty, for about 2 to 3 days, then those little hairs and those little like stinging needles actually go away. But I will show you in a little bit. I don't like to generally wait that long. I like to get mine harvested and use them right away, or preserve them in whatever form I'm going to be doing. And so I'll show you that when we get this basket full. No, stay on my coffee. Ooh, you're wet. Go that way. Go on. Thank you. Oh, look at that. That is horsetail. Normally it grows where it's really sandy, like old riverbeds, but this is actually another edible and medicinal. Well, see? Find something new every day. That's kind of exciting. There's only one though, so I'm not gonna bother harvesting it. Let's see if we can get more to grow in this patch. You know, it's funny because in early spring, typically you think things are growing like in the full sun and where it's the warmest, but when it comes to foraging, it's actually the stinging nettles and the morels that are our first spring foods, and they're actually all out found in the forest, which is kind of beautiful because after a long winter, I love just being out in the woods and seeing all the green growth that's just starting. You're like just at the precipice of all the growing, and then getting to hear all of the birds. It's like both our soul and our bodies just needs that rejuvenation. And the great thing is stinging nettles are packed with nutrients, really high in things like iron. In fact, sometimes they're used if someone is anemic, then they will recommend consuming the stinging nettles. So it's great to be fed both body and soul. So now that we have these back in the house, is deciding what to do with them. When you're just going for an edible, you can use stinging nettles any way that you would just like spinach or any other green. Because the beautiful thing is once they're cooked or dehydrated or freeze dried, then all the little stingy parts, those are gone. So you don't have to worry about eating them like you're gonna get stung. I wouldn't try eating them raw, but they are neutralized. One of our favorite ways to have these is to just saute them like with a little bit of butter and garlic till you just kind of get them wilted, and then an egg over easy on top. Because there's something about that yolk and it just makes all this creamy goodness with them. It's one of our absolute favorite breakfasts. But this batch, we are well past breakfast time. So this batch I am going to actually preserve. It's really funny. We have a plethora of stinging nettles. They grow everywhere around here, just wild. And I thought that I had a jar that I had preserved up in the cupboard. And then I actually went to go find it, and I was going through all my stashes, and I'm like, I am out of stinging nettle. So I actually had to order stinging nettle. I was so irritated with myself. I had to order stinging nettle from an herb store. And I'm like, Melissa, this is ridiculous. You are preserving stinging nettle this year. Like, it is a high priority. I can't believe you're actually buying this from somewhere. So this batch, I am doing very first picking, and it is going straight into the freeze dryer so that I have a backup supply. So we just went ahead and rinsed these off. And I know anytime you're foraging, you always want to make sure that you're not foraging like next to a roadway or somewhere that stuff could get sprayed. And these were so deep back in our woods that I'm not worried about it at all, but definitely want to rinse it off. I mean, we've got deer and animals running around out there, so nobody wants any extra urine. So we just made sure that those got rinsed off. Make sure you wear your gloves again. And I'm gonna go ahead and freeze dry these. Now with stinging nettle, obviously you can eat them, as I said, like as a green, just culinary wise. And they very much remind me of spinach. I don't really wanna say earthy spinach because they don't taste like dirt, but they maybe have a little bit more of an actual flavor than spinach does. But I think it's a really good flavor. Like I said, we use them all the time, like you would kale or spinach or greens in different foods. But medicinal wise, you can tincture it, but I usually always just do an infusion, which is basically a medicinal dose of tea. You just let it steep longer so that there's more of those medicinal properties in there. So you can definitely dehydrate this. You don't have to use a freeze dryer. And I've done you can air dry them, where if you just leave them on the stalk wearing gloves, and then you could just hang them up to dry, and you could just let them air dry. I've done them in the dehydrator as well too. In fact, the first time we tried to dehydrate stinging nettles, this was way back in the day, we had read somewhere that you could put them in like a pillowcase. Well, let me tell you what, the fabric of the pillowcase definitely matters, because we just used whatever extra pillowcase I had laying around. They all ended up molding inside because it wasn't breathable. And we probably stuffed it a little too full because we're like, oh man, we're going to get the whole year's worth of stinging nettles, and we're just going to stuff this pillowcase, and then we're just going to hang it up by the wood stove, and this is going to be fabulous. Well, not so much. So lesson learned there. Brown paper bags actually work much better for the airflow. And if you had like 100% linen or cotton and didn't stuff it full, it probably would work just fine. But you can just simply air dry them, or you can put them in a dehydrator. One of the reasons I love using the freeze dryer though is because that's where you're going to get all of your the highest nutrients saved and the highest medicinal qualities. You're still going to get some of that with dehydrating and air drying, but the freeze dryer actually retains the most, and it's going to keep these viable on the shelf for up to like 25 years. Now, ideally, they'll still be growing and I'll be harvesting and replenishing every year, but it is nice to know that you've got that good backstock. So I'm just going to fill the trays pretty much. It's not like a dehydrator with the way the freeze dryer works. So I can do this a little bit deeper than you would with a dehydrator. You'd want to make sure none of your leaves are touching. So I can do this a little bit thicker for freeze drying than you would with the dehydrator. But I don't actually need to freeze dry a piece of straw. Now there's one caveat. If you are using a freeze dryer for medicinal herbs, there's one thing that you have to do before you start your machine. So you want to make sure that you hit the customize button and that you take the drying temperature down. So this is true both dehydrating as well as freeze drying, but when you're doing things that are medicinal herb-wise, you really don't want them to get above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, ideally. So I'm getting some warnings that this is going to increase my drying time, and I'm completely fine with that. So we just go ahead and hit save, and then we're going to load our trays. And then we are going to make sure on the back side that I have my vent closed so it can get a suction. And then we just hit start. So it's actually been less than 24 hours, and it's time to check and make sure that these are actually fully freeze-dried and ready to go into storage. So we hit the warm tray because I don't want to have super, super cold fingers. But the main reason that you want to use the warming tray function is because you don't want to have any type of condensation that is on the trays that could transfer to the food when you go to put it in the jar for storage, because then if you have moisture, that equals mold, and it's going to spoil in storage. So we've warmed our trays. Right, so true test. Does it sting me? Nope, those little needles are completely inactivated, and that's completely freeze-dried, so we are ready to go. It's actually going to be pretty warm today, so I'm not going to worry about defrosting the machine where it heats itself up. I'm just going to let it thaw at room temperature, and then it will drain. We have just a little bit of ice buildup. When it's these shorter runs, you don't tend to get the big ice buildup that you get when you're doing much longer run type items. And I've actually been using my freeze dryer a lot lately. Believe it or not, at the time of this recording, it's almost the 1st of May, and I still have some of my winter squash left. But I did have some that were starting to go, were showing signs that they weren't going to make it much longer. And so I roasted a bunch of them, pureed it up, and then put it in the freezer. freeze-dried it into pumpkin powder. So this will be great to help thicken up sauces and stews, as well as just reconstitute and make pumpkin pie. Pumpkin cheesecake happens to be, I like that way more than pumpkin pie, or pumpkin roll. So isn't this fascinating though? This was like, I think this was this one or two? I'm trying to remember now what size they were and how many I did, because I baked up a lot, but I used some of the roasted fresh and then I freeze dried the rest. So this was probably about the equivalent of one pumpkin, but in a nice little neat jar that will last for a really long time. If you want more info on freeze drying, you can check out the link below this video, as well as some of my other videos. And in the month of May, they are having a huge sale. So I'll make sure and include all of those details beneath this video for you. But now it's time to take our stinging nettle in. I'm going to show you how we're going to package this up for long-term storage, and also talk a little bit more about the medicinal properties of stinging nettles. I'll see you in the kitchen. Right, I have to say I get asked often if I think the freeze dryer is actually worth it, because it is an investment piece of equipment. It's the most expensive piece of equipment I own as far as food preservation goes. And in full disclosure, Harvest Right, which is the manufacturer of the freeze dryer, they did send me mine in exchange for my opinion. And honestly, I turned them down a couple of times because I was like, well, I've got my canner, I've got my dehydrator, I've got all these other means of using to preserve our food. I don't really think I need this thing. And then I got it, and I've had it for a couple of years now, and I really do absolutely love it. As far as, is it really worth the price? If you use it. It's really that's really the deal with any piece of equipment, right? If you're using it often, then yes, it can and will pay for itself, but you actually have to have a plan for it and put it to use. So we are going to get these. I think what I love about it is all I have to do is like push button. I don't actually have to be there really doing anything. It does all the work for me, which is really great. So I am going to be putting all of these leaves. Now, anytime you are dehydrating or freeze drying leaves and you plan on using them for medicinal purposes or just to retain as much of the properties as is, you actually don't want to grind them up or cut them. You want to leave them as whole as possible until right at use. And the reason for that is because the more surface matter there is, the faster it's going to release its medicinal properties and they are going to be exposed. So I generally leave mine whole, which means I need a slightly larger jar, but that payoff is completely fine for me. You can see these are very brittle. What's great is the freeze-dried leaves like this, if you do kale chips, they stay brittle. And that can be something when you want like something crunchy to eat that gets a little bit frustrating with dehydrated foods, because not all of your dehydrated food will stay like that brittle, crunchy long term. They end up kind of a little bit chewy. So that's what's really great about these. So I'm going to go and smush these down. I'm going to try to get all of this in this same jar. And if I end up scrunching some of them, crunching them up a little bit, that's going to be okay. Now, as I said, the great thing about stinging nettle is it has a lot of culinary purposes, which is great, but it also has those medicinal purposes. So it can help aid your immune system. It's really well known for helping with seasonal allergies, as well as a kidney tonic and a diuretic. Now, anytime you're using herbs medicinally, you need to really do your homework and do full research, because just because something's natural doesn't mean that it's right for you or that it's safe for everyone. And one of the things to note with stinging nettle, using it medicinal wise, is if you have diabetes, it can affect your glucose. So that's something that you'll definitely want to pay attention to, and only be using stinging nettle at a therapeutic medicinal dose in conjunction with the care of your medical provider. But I now have a half gallon, which means I will not have to order this again. I will have it on hand, and I'll end up doing more. This was just the first batch, and I wanted to make sure I really did have some on the shelf. Now, for medicinal purposes with stinging nettle, you can make a tincture from it. You can have it in a pill form where you would grind up the herb and put it in a capsule. But really, my favorite way to consume stinging nettle is in a medicinal tea or a hot infusion when you're talking herbal speak. So I will leave this, and the leaves are mainly in full form. I mean, when I was pushing them down, they got a little bit scrunched up, but as I said, I'm not like cutting and sifting these so that they're little tiny small pieces. And the other reason I'm not doing that is because I can also use this for food. In fact, one of my favorite ways to use stinging nettle, especially when you're using it in something like a lasagna, where sometimes spinach can get liquidy. You know, when you're cooking lasagna, like it adds a lot of liquid. Well, when you use it in the freeze-dried form, it's fabulous because it'll help absorb some of that liquid and it will cook, but you don't end up with kind of like that extra like soupy, watery stuff in your lasagna. But it's a great way to get a lot of added nutrients into those types of dishes. For something that I'm going to be using with just in the next year, I have found that by just making sure that this lid is screwed on really tight, that I don't need to add extra oxygen absorbers or do a vacuum seal. However, if it's something that I want to be storing for really long term, then I do use a mason jar lid and top, you know, the metal lid with the screw down band, and I will vacuum seal it for extra long storage capacity. Now, for those of you who are in the Pioneering Today Academy, we have a deep dive where we go really deep into all of the different medicinal properties as well as your different doses. So make sure and check that out for existing members. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the Pioneering Today Academy, we'll have links below where you can check out more about that. If you want to learn more about using herbs and growing them, check out these videos.